What do you see the lay of the land, the crisis that we're in now?
I see something that is kind of frightening actually at times. When I go on walks, incognito walks in Old Town, when I get out of the car and walk around the Lentz area, go down to Delta Park and out toward the airport and the Marine Drive sections of town, those are just a few of the really intense hotspots, also Inner East Side. I see too many people that are here merely to find their next drugs, to continue to move on. I mean, Portland has, unfortunately, a reputation for being a city that has access to the hard drugs that are on our market now. Most meth is a new meth, they call it. I won't get into the details all of it because I'll screw it up. But the fact is they're readily and available, they're cheap, and we have a reputation for having open air drug markets that are easy to access. And unfortunately, when someone's that late stage in their addiction, we call it a bottom, you need an intervention or that it's not going to work. And most have cut off ties with people that love them. So I do think of them as being homeless because they've lost that heart and that home connection in their lives. And they're here existing on our streets. And they're causing a lot of pain and suffering for those that are also houseless, that aren't in that same category. So there's unspeakable crimes taking place on the streets to other houseless people. And there's also people that live in those neighborhoods that feel trapped in their homes and don't feel like they can access their sidewalks and their parks nearby. And so what you're experiencing in Portland, Dan, is just, we're choosing to tolerate the intolerable, if you will. And it creates a big division, and it creates a lack of trust for those who have lived in Portland a long time and love this city and are finally just in a divisive place with government who hasn't responded to this crisis. And so I always like to start, that's not the majority of houseless, that in fact is the minority, but they're the ones that are like sucking all the air out of the room, if you will. And then there's those countless people that are houseless that, because this is an expensive city to live in, and because working class wages haven't kept up, because there's factors like domestic violence, there's a whole host of factors, they're also on our streets. However, that audience, which is larger, would be much easier to on-ramp into permanent successful housing. So those are I like to just, thanks for asking the question, allowing me to have due dialogue with you to explain that challenge. And I would say that the county who runs all the houseless services, and bless their hearts, they've been at this for a while, they haven't focused a lot on, they've been in a housing first, housing only blueprint, which is fine for much of the houseless population. But in my opinion, if we don't tackle this grim issue that almost seems like it's difficult to talk about it, I haven't heard a lot of elected officials talk about this, so I'm doing the best I can. How are we going to address it? And we can't be in denial any longer. So I would say it's almost like we have addicts and then we have enablers. And that's in a micro level, but it's in a macro level. And the city and the county have become, government and services have been enabling this behavior to persist on our streets. And we have to call it out. And so I'm here doing the best I can as a new elected official. I've been in 16 months and have had the audacity to not just go along with the status quo. It's something that I've kind of been my entire life. I come into this job with lived experience, losing a brother 8 years ago on our streets, who also became late stage drug addicted, did not follow through on mental health therapies, and had a life that eventually led to the streets. And like most people on our streets, if they're there too long and they have these double or triple diagnoses, they die on our streets. And so my brother was one of those people. And so I come into this with that lens. That's why I jumped into this race 2 years ago to fulfill Nick Fish's term, because I was very frustrated as a voter that I wasn't seen as being honest and as clear about this problem, and therefore we can then get into the solutions. So I've been solution focused and driven since I got in, and I will just keep going against the headwinds internally and yes, externally, to get some real tangible results so our city can get out of the ditch that we're in.
How frustrated are you? I'm looking at this article from last summer that you were talking about having work on these start in August and then September and then end of December. And here we are, the end of February. and there's nothing been created.
Yeah, well, it's been 6 months and I'm an ambitious person. So I want to light some fire under people at the city and the county to get this moving. I am pleased that I have a great team. I'm pleased that we have several sites and we are seeing some momentum at those sites. Quite frankly, I was well aware there'd be pushback in neighborhoods. I've never seen neighborhoods welcome government services, even some that you would assume they'd want. It's change. It kind of ruins the flow of what they think of their neighborhood is like. But man, when you see what you witness around our city and you assume that we're just going to take an unsanctioned camp that's full of a lot of garbage and some debris that is also dangerous and just shove that into your neighborhood, of course you're going to push back. But when we have had time to do dialogue and actually have the providers come meet with them and work on good neighbor agreements, we start to see a real turn for the better. In fact, the Multnomah Village neighborhood, I'm sure you heard they were in pretty big opposition about us citing a village out in their neighborhood. But just recently they voted 73-20 in favor of moving forward with a good neighbor agreement. And that's because we had a chance to do dialogue. We had a chance to explain what the villages are and quite frankly, what they're not. And so having a setting that's restorative, having services in the neighborhood, ensuring that we have a buffer zone around the village, which is really important because not just for the people who live in that neighborhood currently, but for the villagers, because we want people to lean into services and we want them to get sober one day at a time. So the last thing we need is for them to walk out of the village setting and then run into people that they've used with in their community. And so it's really important to have that buffer. One of the best ways to get out of addiction is to have community and have support. Isolation will really is the worst thing for an addict, which is one reason why it's not great to go from the streets if you're in a late stage addiction into a studio apartment. You really need to have a community setting. So I'm thrilled with the results. We're transforming, Dan, as you know, the temporary villages that were built. Those are the camps that were built in Old Town and Water Avenue. Our office was handed that as well in September. And so we've been transforming those into a village setting, and we're already seeing better results where people, All Good, a wonderful provider of one of those settings, has been able to put 15 people just the last couple of months into permanent housing.
Let's see here. I guess I can. I'm switching the gallery view here, but Brian, all right, I guess I have to go back to speaker. Okay. The site on Multnomah Village, what is the situation with the FEMA deed? Can you overcome that?
Yeah, absolutely. We're in an emergency, Dan. And so when we asked for the monies to be spent on an emergency, I can't think of anything more obvious than the emergency of houselessness in the city of Portland right now. And so we're using the dollars as they were designed. And so that I'm not worried about that at all.
Okay. I was talking yesterday to Moses Ross with the Multnomah Neighborhood Association, and talking about that good neighbor agreement. He was telling me that it wasn't so much that the neighbors are in agreement with this village, it's that they felt it was inevitable and that this is the best that they could do. Otherwise, their voice wouldn't be heard. What do you say to that?
I say that they voted 73-20. We have more and more people from the Multnomah Village neighborhood leaning in and wanting to be a part of the solution and wanting to be part of the welcoming of the village and being volunteers at the village. So, you know, Dan, I got to lean into the willing, because Portland can't continue to be a city that is really good at making proclamations about what's wrong, but not doing any action. And so this is a challenge throughout the city. And I'm just grateful that we're going to have a shot to prove that this is on the right path, and that we have neighborhoods like Multnomah Village who will agree to be welcoming neighbors.
Moses Ross told me that there was a lack of initial communication between your office and the selection of this site, that he got a courtesy call 1 to 2 hours before it was announced, and that he would have liked to have seen more communication from you folks.
Yeah, we didn't want to do communication until we were 100% clear that there was a green light from the city. And so this has been a challenge for our office as well. You can't really do conversations with 30 different neighborhood associations when you don't have clarity if it's even going to be a viable site. So we reach out as soon as we find out that it is viable. And then we do our best once that's clear to reach out to the neighborhood associations. I understand their sentiment, and that's just the reality of this work right now.
Kylie, she's a neighbor there, and she said, and she's against this, and these are harsh words, but she says, Dan Ryan's been a bully. We neighbors aren't obstacles. We should be treated as partners in this. If Dan Ryan wants to be successful in finding sites for these, he should sweeten the deal for neighbors. And I went over to the Hazelwood neighborhood. I talked to Arlene Kimura, who's the president of the Hazelwood Neighborhood Association. And I said, I had a neighbor over at Multnomah say that Dan Ryan is a bully. What do you think? And she says, this is the president of the Hazelwood Neighborhood Association. I think that he is passionate about what he believes in, and he has such fervor that he's not willing to listen to anyone else. I don't think he intends to be a bully, but I think that is the message that we are receiving from him, that I know best. What do you say to that?
I say that when you're a leader at a time like this in a crisis, you have to just take action, and you've got to make Portland a better city. So I'm excited that we are moving forward with these villages. And I'm really also excited that there'll be a place to test innovation. We have people on our streets that are suffering quite a bit. And then we think that we're just supposed to magically move them into housing. And so I'm excited to also get some data sets going on the ground. So we'll be able to test people's resilience when it comes to behavioral health, mental health, looking at their education and their workforce, and looking at how they're doing in the villages. And then we will have actually a system to move people from the streets to stability. I hear what they're saying, but they're also the same people that are complaining that there are too many houseless people in their neighborhoods. And so I have to do something because that's my job. And so we are looking at having geographic diversity. You just kind of helped explain that when you talked about the neighborhoods today. And I think anyone that had the audacity to run for city council like I did and got sworn in just 16 months ago is going to take a lot of heat. So I'm clear with who I am. I'm supposed to be leading my hometown out of this ditch that we're in, and I'm doing the best I can. Of course, I listened to all the neighbors. In fact, that's why we've edited our good neighbor agreements, and that we've actually invested in services to ensure that there is a buffer zone around the villages. That's something that hasn't been done when other shelters have been sited in neighborhoods. So I'm also serving on top of failed promises for over a decade and do nothing solutions, if you will, about this crisis on our streets. So it's okay. It's my job. It's my role. The mayor gave me this assignment. I decided to actually take some action.
Are you frustrated by what might be perceived as NIMBYism? Not in my backyard. I mean, people want something done, but then it comes down time to pick a spot, and then you get pushback.
I try to not judge it that way. I've been around a while. I was a part of building some housing in Seattle in the early 90s called Bailey Boucher House, and no one wanted HIV patients in their neighborhood. So it was a pretty fierce pushback. Then once it was open and operating, I saw a real turn. Some of the same people that were against it leaned in, and I think they never needed me to remind them that they were against it. So I think any big dramatic change like this is a shock to the system. But I always ask them, so right now you're complaining about all the unsanctioned camping in your neighborhood. You're talking about the inaction from government. Now we are here to provide some viable hope that we'll see some solutions and actually move people off the streets and into housing successfully. I thank you for being a part of the solution. We have to all be in this together as one city. And that's why we're really focused on making sure there's some geographic diversity of where these villages are located.
Arlene Kimura is concerned. Her impression is the TriMet lot, there'd be about 60 pods there. She thinks that's too big. It should be in smaller places. Otherwise, and also the Multnomah people said this also, they're concerned if you put these villages here, you're going to get satellite homeless camping in the creep, and that these buffers aren't big enough.
I'm excited that we're just staying focused, and we'll find more villages. And then we have to address the challenge of the people that are on our streets that are causing the most harm to themselves and others, to other houseless people and to residents. And so until we get to the bottom of the fact that we have too many people in our city right now that are houseless, that are homeless, that are doing drugs, hard drugs, and that's their main focus every day. And they'll do whatever it takes to get those drugs. And with that comes some pretty psychotic behavior, including, I woke up this morning to a street in my neighborhood where everyone's garbages were like torn apart last night. I've now been around long enough to know that that's part of perhaps one of the conditions of this new meth that really messes with one's brain. And so people like hoard garbage, they throw it all around. So this is impacting the city everywhere. So we have to look into how we do some mandatory treatments. What is the plan? I've called together my first meeting with people at the Salem, Representative Nose and Senator Lieber. In that meeting was also Ebony Clark from the county and Mike Schmidt, the DA, and also Mike Myers, the head of community safety of the city. And I go, come on, you guys, we got to get to the bottom of this. It's not tolerable to continue to accept this behavior in the city of Roses.
One person who works for the homeless was telling me the neighbors are misguided, that they don't need to worry about the people who are willing to move into these villages. But then Kylie pointed out that the proclamation that was passed last year, it talks about people from high impact camps being moved into the safe rest villages, which then makes me think, well, these are going to be the people who are most drug addicted and potentially have been committing crimes that are going to move into these camps as a priority. Is that the case?
The case is you have to have people that are willing to actually receive some of the services. I do think that hopefully some will be people that are in the late stage of addiction that are willing to consider services. But I think it's important that we have a real good mix. I think it helps when that happens in any community setting. And so again, it's the community safety director at the city, the fact that I'm in conversations with the mayor, with Mingus Maps, the Commissioner Maps who oversees 911, people are experiencing a lack of response when they call 911, a lack of response when the police show up late and say their hands are tied. Dan, we got to stop this. Stop blaming every other bureau, every other government official, and start coming together and actually do something. And so I will keep fighting for pragmatic solutions. I will tell the truth about what's going on. And yes, I think it's a shared responsibility and a shared sacrifice for every neighborhood to be part of this solution. And that's just me loving on my hometown and doing the best I can to get us out of the ditch we're in.
Moses Brown is saying it's going to take 4 to 6 months to get the one open in Mulan Village. And Arlene was telling me she'll be surprised if it's open before next winter. Do you agree with him?
Well, I think that as long as the neighbors maybe have more of a willing attitude, I think that'll go much faster. Definitely some of the headwinds and the delays have been working with the neighborhoods. And yet I also see the neighborhoods as one of our best solutions. I will say that my team is working their tails off, and I think it'll be much sooner than what Arlene's hoping for.
One of the frustrations with neighbors is they didn't know the locations, and then they put out the 70, but then those have changed. And I asked your staff for what's the current locations of potential locations, and they said they're not releasing that. Something like I forget what Brian said, but it was something like they don't want to cause concern. I'm paraphrasing and probably getting it wrong, but why not release the potential locations you're looking at so that neighbors can start to come to terms with this? We're
a small, mighty team, and we have to stay focused, Dan. And when you allow leaks to continue and to go out, and then it just riles up the neighborhood, and then that just consumes so much time for nothing. So, I've been through that before with, we just barely were into a conversation with Portland Public Schools, like barely. And we were looking at some possible selections of sites that might be possible, one being the former Adams and Whitaker Middle School. And before you know it, it was leaked and the whole neighborhood came unglued. And we hadn't even had a dotted line verbal agreement with PPS that was a viable spot. So we were ending up spending so much time on nothing. And I got to be efficient with the resources so that we can actually get some things built and then we can take action. So we love to engage in dialogue once it's clear that it's a viable place to site the village. And we have many moving parts on that.
While you think, I'll look over my questions here. Are you still looking for property owners willing to work with you?
Absolutely. We're looking at property owners. I've been working with the attorneys at the city and with the bureaus to actually treat this more like an emergency, give us more authority to cite properties. We don't have a government right now that knows how to be nimble and to respond in an emergency clearly. And so this is where we're at. And Commissioner Ryan's office is taking the lead to help us learn how to be more responsive at a time of an emergency. And I think that we're on the right path. I do look forward to some announcements coming further that will allow us to behave more like we're an emergency, giving us more authority to move forward. So I think what's important to remember about some of the resistance from the neighborhoods is that when people are asked if they want these services in our city, they say yes. It's like really high percentage, 80-some%. Then when it's somewhat close to where they live, it suddenly flips. So that's the scene that I'm in. So as an elected official, I have to be focused on solutions. I have to take action. That's what you're supposed to do when you're serving in 2022. And so I will keep fighting for my hometown. I think our best days are yet to come, and we're being tested with this challenge of homelessness in the city of Portland. And we have plenty of work to do. But one thing that isn't an option for me is to do nothing and continue on the same slow pace that we've been on.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your candid answers. I really do.
You're welcome.